Hey friends, so today we're making some flavoured breads and some inclusion breads. So I'm making two types of bread. I'm making a chili herb bread and a chocolate loaf bread as well. So they're both gluten-free and dairy-free. So they have kind of the same base recipe, which is my normal recipe, and then I'm adding the flavourings in. So the first thing I'm doing is measuring out 110 grams of almond milk, and then I'm adding 30 grams of sugar to that. And the first one I'm making on this day is the chili herb bread. So what inspired me to make this chili herb bread was I recently had a trip down to Cornwall, and whilst I was down there I found this Cornish salt company that sold this chili salt, and it smelled delicious. So I thought, let's make this into bread. So I'm covering up this bowl with cling film, and then I'm going to put it in the microwave for about 30 seconds just to warm it through so that we can add the yeast to it. I just cover it with cling film so nothing, either goes into the milk or my milk doesn't, kind of foam out of the bowl either if I accidentally put it on too long. So once that's warmed through, take the cling film off, obviously, and I put it on the side because I cover it back up with the same cling film whilst the yeast is rising. And I add 12 grams of yeast. This is the, what's it called? The active dried yeast. So you need to put it in the milk for it to rise to get the coating off. And this one that I use is gluten-free. So just be careful because some yeast will contain gluten. So I mix through the yeast, and then I'm just going to cover it back up and put it in a spot that's quite warm for it to rise. It's quite a warm day this day, so I just put it on the side. But if it's like a colder day in the winter, you might want to kind of warm your oven through a teeny bit, turn it off, put the light on, and put your yeast in there to rise. Okay, so once I've got the yeast rising, I move on to step 2, which is kind of my wetter ingredients. I mix them all through in this bowl separately, and then I add them into the dry ingredients. So I start off with 125 grams of almond milk, and again I'm still working on the chili bread here. Then I'm going to add 16 grams of this blonde psyllium husk. This is whole psyllium husk. If you're using like ground milled, then you would only need 14 grams. I get mine off of Amazon. It's really integral to gluten-free baking, so if you're looking into gluten-free bread baking and you haven't really done it before, check it out. I'll link it below on Amazon. I think you could probably find it in some health food stores. I haven't really seen it around though, and I'm in the East Midlands of the UK. I haven't really seen it anywhere, but I get mine on Amazon. So I mix that through with a fork, and if I was to just leave the psyllium husk with the milk, it forms into a gel, and it acts like a binder, kind of like gluten works in normal bread. So it's really integral to gluten-free baking if you haven't tried it before. And then I add the rest of my wet ingredients into this bowl just to make my life easier. So I add 55 grams of oil. This is sunflower oil. Olive oil would probably have better flavour though if you wanted to do that. Or you could just use vegetable oil. It depends what kind of flavour you want. I think for this bread, olive oil would be really good. Then I add about a tablespoon worth of apple cider vinegar. That just creates a more acidic environment for the yeast rise. And then I add 1 egg white, not the yolk. This is a medium egg. So I like to have this all just into one bowl. Like I say, it just makes my life easier. So I'm trying to be careful here not to get eggshell into my mixture, because that would be annoying. So then I get rid of that, wash my hands off. And then I have my KitchenAid bowl. If you don't have a stand mixer, you definitely don't need a stand mixer for this, but it will make your life easier. So if you have one, I would use it. So now onto my flour, or shall I say starches. So I do 110 grams of tapioca starch, then 90 grams of potato starch, and 80 grams of cornstarch. What made me start using the starches was, if you look at the Warburton's gluten-free bread, which is my personal favourite gluten-free bread that Shop bought, it is all starches, except from the flour mixture on the outside. So I did a similar thing. I have all these starches, and then I do have a flour that I coat the outside of the bread in. So that's what gave me the inspiration to start doing it this way. Starches are lighter, and because it's harder for the gluten-free bread to kind of have that structure, because the starches are so much lighter, they hold that structure and they don't collapse and they don't go dense like most other gluten-free breads will do. And I do it in this ratio just because that's what I found has worked best. I don't like too much tapioca. If you use too much tapioca, it creates kind of this weird sensation in your mouth. So that's why I feel like I've kind of got the perfect ratio here. So 110 tapioca, 90 potato, and 80 cornstarch. You could definitely mess around with the ratios, but this is just what I prefer. So yeah, this is kind of my dry ingredients all going in now. So once I have all my starches in, then I can get my xanthan gum and my baking powder. So I use xanthan gum again for binding, because gluten-free bread and gluten-free baking in general struggles to have that same structure. And then I use baking powder just to give it an extra oomph in the oven, an extra kind of rise, just to create a really good air structure, because I quite like a quite light bread. So I use 2 teaspoons of xanthan gum and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And then I like to mix that through with the flour so they're mixed through properly. So then we can see that's all mixed through. So I get that off my scales now. Done with the scales for the minute. And because I only have one bowl and one casserole dish, I just do them separately. They're 2 different types of bread. But anyway, now I'm adding the yeast. So I'm adding the yeast mixture that we made previously. And you can see that it's had a good rise and it's nice and frothy. So we know that it's going to rise well in our bread. So I like to mix that through first with the flour before I add any salt, because I've heard that salt can inhibit your yeast. To be honest, I've never tried it the other way around, so I don't know how much effect it has, but I always like to mix my yeast through with my flour first and then add my salt. So I get that plugged in, mix through. It's not exactly like it would do any harm either way. Well, it doesn't do any harm not doing the salt first. So I just do that, except from multiple times I've forgotten salt and then had to add it through. So I like to do it when I do the recipe. I like to take things off as I go, just to make my life easier. Then I add our wet ingredients, so the psyllium husk mixture and all of that stuff. You can see that the psyllium husk is formed like a gel now. So make sure you get every last drop of that out. I'm just giving that a quick mix through. So sometimes I need to add more milk, sometimes I don't. I think it just depends on a lot of factors. It's just one of those things when it comes to baking. Here's the chili salt that I was talking about though. smelled super good. I add about 3 tablespoons worth of this chili salt, and it creates a really nice flavour. But yeah, with milk, sometimes I don't need to add the extra milk and sometimes I do. I just do it off of looks. So at this point I can see that it's looking a bit dry. So I add in my chili salt. Even looking back on it, it looks good. And I add in my herbs as well. So I had some fresh herbs from the garden that I picked. So some rosemary and some basil. And I washed that off and then just kind of picked that, ripped it into smaller pieces. I also added, I don't know, about a tablespoon of paprika to it. I just love the smell and taste of paprika. And it's the smoked paprika too, I believe. At least maybe it's not. But anyway, yeah, on the state, once I get my herbs and everything, I can see it's still looking pretty dry. So I add 25 grams of extra milk to this one. The chili one. For the chocolate one, I didn't need to add any extra milk. So, I don't know, it just changes. Changes on the recipe. I think the chocolate one didn't need any extra milk because of the chocolate and the oils in it and everything. So you can see I'm just ripping out my basil and adding it into the mixture. It smells so good. The fresh basil, the chili. It was a really good bread. And I would definitely make it again. Probably a bigger loaf. So sometimes I 1.5 size this loaf if I'm looking for more bread. But because it's gluten free, and I'm the only one that eats gluten free bread in my household. Well, as in my boyfriend eats the gluten free bread too, but he can eat normal bread, so I don't need to make a ton of bread because he can eat the normal bread. I'm just going to eat the gluten free bread on a daily basis. But this I made for a dinner, so I had quite a few compliments on the bread. So anyway, I'm just mixing all of that through. You can see now it's a lot more sticky, it's a lot more elasticy. It's what we want, really. So when it's looking like this, that's how you know it's at the right ratio of liquid to flour. Gluten-free baking tends to need a higher ratio of liquid to flour than normal bread baking. So anyway, I get my vanillin out. I always line it with baking paper or parchment paper, and then I cover that with flour. I do have a liner somewhere, I just don't know where it is, so I always use baking paper, and then I use that baking paper to put it into the Dutch oven. I just find that works easiest for me. Anyway, so I use gluten-free bread flour. I use Dove's Farm gluten-free bread flour to put at the base of the vanillin and cover the bread with. I'm presuming you could use a different gluten-free flour of any variety, really. I think rice flour would work quite well for the outside, but I've never tried anything else. I have only just used the Dove's Farm gluten-free bread flour, so I wouldn't like to say for sure. Then I shape my dough into a ball. I only do the shaping once before the rise. I just find the less you work with it, the easier. So anyway, I oil my hands before I touch the dough too, to make it my life a lot easier. That way it doesn't stick to your hands so much, because it can be quite a sticky dough. can see the piece of the basil in there and everything. And I also score my dough before the rising, otherwise it will just break in some random point, so it's easier to give it a kind of escape point. So I coat it with some more of that gluten-free flour, bread flour by Dove's Farm, and then I score it. I do have a bread scorer, so I use that, but you could definitely just use a knife. The scoring pattern I did for this I thought would turn out pretty. It turned out interesting. So one line would probably just work better. I wouldn't copy what I'm doing on this day for the pattern, but you could definitely just look up scoring patterns and follow one of those. I'm no expert when it comes to scoring the bread. So that's it before the rise. And then I cover that with a kitchen towel and then move on to my chocolate bread. So this is the chocolate I'm using. It's a may contain milk. So if you have a very bad, if you have a bad dairy allergy, don't try this because it does may contain milk. Just use a dairy-free chocolate. But I had this and it needed using up, and I've found that I'm fine with it. But it is a may contain, so just be warned of that. So I chop it up into the smaller pieces for the chocolate bread. And I'm using this whole bar. The whole bar was a lot of chocolate in the bread. So you could definitely use half this amount. I think this is 180 gram bar. You could definitely use half the amount of chocolate in this chocolate bread. This was my first time trying either of these bread recipes. Well, it was my usual bread recipe, but either of these inclusions or flavours. And I loved experimenting with it, but you could definitely use less chocolate if you're not a huge chocolate person. I'm a huge chocolate person though, so to me it was divine. Well, a dark chocolate person. I love dark chocolate. This is dark chocolate. And it reminded me of pan au chocolats. I haven't had them in years, and it just had kind of a similar effect. The bread with the chocolate was so good. I would definitely make this again. I ate it for breakfast for like 3 days straight. So really good. So I'm just using the same bowl that I made the yeast in for the chili bread. I'm just reusing that bowl. So again, same amounts. 110 grams almond milk. I did 35 grams of sugar for this. You can maybe use slightly more, depending on how sweet you want your bread. And then once that's warmed through, I add my 12 grams of yeast again. I do think a slightly sweeter dough and less chocolate could be a good shout. So if you give it a go, let me know. Like, for example, maybe 60 grams of sugar and then half the amount of chocolate, I think would be good. Like half the bar of chocolate, 60 grams of sugar. Or white chocolate and raspberry would be a really good bread flavour. Maybe I'll have to give that a go at some point. I'm making a white chocolate and berry cake this weekend for a dinner party that I'm really looking forward to making. And right now, white chocolate and raspberry is really on the mind. I think it's the summer months. The summer flavours. Sounds delicious anyway. So anyway, I'm cling film that and getting that into the microwave. Again, for like 30 seconds. I do it on a high for 30 seconds at least. And it's always at a good temperature. I've done longer. Like, I've heated a whole jug of milk and then added the amount for the yeast. And I found every time I've done that, I ended up making a mistake, and it either wasn't nearly warm enough, or it would just be way too hot and it would like kill my yeast. So I tried to do it this way now. It makes more sense anyway, because you have to measure out and let it rise into this bowl anyway. So it makes for less washing up than if you do it in all your milk in one jug, warm it all up, and then add it separately. Anyway, so let that yeast rise. Move on to the step 2, which is like the psyllium husk wet ingredient step again. So only make one difference in this step. which is the milk. So I used chocolate milk for this step this time. I wouldn't usually do something like that, but I had spare chocolate milk in the fridge that I'd been drinking. It was a soya chocolate milk. It was really good. I've never used soy milk in this recipe, so I didn't know how that would turn out, but it turned out just fine. Overall, this bread was slightly more dense than my usual bread, and I think that's just because the chocolate melted, and it stayed melted for a really long time, so just all the oils and everything made it slightly denser, but it was still quite light and airy overall. So anyway, point being, I don't think the soy milk made much of a difference, but I definitely wouldn't say go out and buy chocolate milk for this recipe. You could definitely just use your normal milk, and then you could add in either a little bit of cocoa powder, maybe like a tablespoon of cocoa powder, or you could just leave it a plain dough and then add in your chocolate. Then I add in my 55 grams of oil again, my egg white, and my tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. So all the same other than the chocolate milk. And again, because I used soy milk instead of almond milk, maybe that's why I didn't need to add extra milk in this recipe like I normally do. Or like I did for the chili bread, because I had to add 25 grams extra for that one, and I didn't need to add any extra for this one. Could be a whole host of different reasons why. But that's why texture and looking at it by eye matter more than just reading straight off the recipe. Then I move on to my dry ingredients. So it's the same thing, 110 grams of tapioca starch, 90 grams of potato starch, 80 grams of cornstarch. I considered adding cocoa powder, but I didn't. But if you're going to, I would add it at this step. And then my 2 teaspoons of xanthan gum, 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And I'm obviously not using chili salt in this recipe, so a teaspoon of chili salt once I've added in my yeast. Of not chili salt, of normal salt. Although a chocolate and chili bread could be good too. So when I make them in my KitchenAid, I have the dough hook on, and because it's gluten-free bread, you don't have to worry about over-kneading it, so that's beneficial. But in general, I just do it until it's very well mixed through. I used the last of my cornstarch on this day. So I'm really trying to get out every last bit of it, and I actually ended up exactly on the right amount, so that was lucky. This is also the step where I add in the chocolate, but I didn't want to add it in before I mixed everything through, because then the chocolate would break up quite a lot. So I mix through all my dry ingredients to make sure they're incorporated. Then I add in my yeast mixture. And then I get that mixed through. Again, it had a nice rise, it's nice and foamy. That's what you want your yeast to look like. If it's just looking like it hasn't really changed since you began like putting it into the bowl, then you might want to buy some more yeast, because it's probably dead. I know some people store their yeast in the fridge. I go through my yeast so quickly. And I should probably buy bigger packets of yeast because I go through it so quickly. I'm always making bread or other things. I plan on making donuts this weekend as well, so because I have a dinner party like I said before. So I just have I'm always going through my yeast. But I know other people who don't go through their yeast so fast stick their yeast in the fridge, and then you can come back to it, or in the freezer even, I think. And then you can take it out, defrost it, and come back to using it. So if that's something that might be useful to you, give that a try. And then I added my wet ingredients. It's looking very dark and brown this time from the chocolate milk. I wouldn't say you can necessarily taste the chocolate milk. I definitely think if you use cocoa powder, it would be more impactful in the general dough. You can just taste the chocolate, really. Anyway, so mix that all through. So once that's all mixed, I can add in my chocolate. So I just have the chocolate that I crumbled up before, and I add in my salt now as well, like a tablespoon of salt. And I do coat my chocolate in some, I think I use tapioca starch to coat it in. You want to coat it in some sort of flour or starch because otherwise it will sink in your dough. It's the same as like cupcakes or anything. You'll just find that all your chocolate is at the bottom. So I did that. You don't have to coat it too much in this, just a general coating is a good idea. And then once I feel like that's coated through, I mix it all through. You can mix it by hand if you don't want to break up any of your chocolate, but I'm okay with breaking up little bits of it, just want some bigger chunks. You can see that the chocolate's making it a little bit harder for my KitchenAid to mix, but then it all looks good. So I do the same thing as with the other bread, and I pop it in a glass bowl this time instead of vanishing because I don't have a separate one. And I pop it in a glass bowl this time, lined again with baking or parchment paper and some bread flour. And doesn't that look delicious? So yeah, I make sure to coat my hands with oil first as well before I handle the dough. So it's better to use a banneton overall instead of a different type of bowl because the wood doesn't take away the heat and it's more of an insulator to the bread to help it rise. I think metals are worse because that absorbs all the heat from your yeast, and so it makes the yeast cooler and takes away from its rise, and it will take much longer to rise. I'm not sure where glass lies on the list. I'm guessing plastic's not too bad either. This is just what I had, so it's what I used. So anyway, I oil my hands up, ready to get that chocolate loaf and shape it. So once I've got it in a nice ball, you can pinch any seams if you need to. Then again, I'll coat it with bread flour and score it. This time I accidentally scored it first and then added flour. I don't think it really matters though, to be honest. Usually I do add flour and then score it. So I leave them both to rise for 1 hour. Then they went into the fridge for an hour. And then I took them out for half an hour. And then I baked them for 50 minutes covered in my Dutch oven with the lid on. And then 15 minutes uncovered. So this is them going into the oven after rising. And this is my chili herb bread coming out the oven. And it looks delicious, and it smelled delicious, and I made club sandwiches with it, and it was delicious. And then this is about to come up is my chocolate bread going into the oven. You can see it's risen to double its volume. Here's the the chili herb bread before I slice into it. And I'll tap on it so you can hear that it's hollow inside. And you want to make sure you leave it for at least an hour or two before you cut into it. And then here you can even hear the chocolate still popping coming out the oven. And it was so ooey gooey, even after a couple hours before when I finally cut into it after a couple hours, it was so delicious. So I hope you give them a go. Here's it once it's cooled down a little bit. It's making me want to make more. And I might have to, and maybe try a white chocolate one. But anyway, here's me slicing up the tomato chili bread. That was a bad slice from me. I'm not the best bread cutter, even though I make so much bread. I have a bread knife here. That was a better slice. Ooh. I've got just a plastic board and a wooden table, so it moves around a lot. But yeah, you can see that it's super soft, a nice hard crust, but super soft on the inside. It stays together well. This was a couple hours after it came out the oven, and it was still soft the next day. Even though pretty much all of it was eaten, there was still a little bit left, and that was still soft the next day. The chocolate bread I ate mostly to myself, and that stayed soft for multiple days. And that can be the struggle with gluten-free bread, is it can go really dense really quickly. But you can see that there, the crumb structure is pretty good. If you want a better crumb, leave it in the fridge overnight. But if you want to eat it the same day, then I would just leave it in the fridge 1 hour after the initial rise. But anyway, I hope you give it a go. And if you do, please let me know how it tastes. And I'll see you next time. So thank you. Bye.